The cold blue light of a monitor cast long shadows across Dr. Anya Sharma's tired face inside her remote mountain barn. Only the low hum of electronics and the relentless whisper of wind against the weathered walls dared to break the profound silence. For weeks, something had been stealing food from her barn. Not just a handful of grain, but entire 50-pound sacks of high-protein feed, vital for her small-scale wildlife rehabilitation center. Anya, a brilliant but reclusive wildlife biologist, had finally installed a covert infrared camera. Now, the grainy monochrome footage flickered before her. The digital timestamp in the corner clicked steadily past 3 a.m. A shadow then filled the frame, vast and indistinct at first. It solidified into a shape too immense, too powerful to be any local fox or coyote. A massive grizzly bear materialized, a ghost in the monochrome night, its every movement etched with a pained, deliberate slowness that spoke of old wounds and deeper struggles. The footage revealed not a monster, but a survivor, every ragged breath a testament to enduring hardship. Anya, herself a survivor hiding from a world that had broken her heart, felt an immediate, unwelcome flicker of recognition. This animal's raw desperation mirrored her own quiet, carefully guarded grief. The bear finished eating, its massive head lifting slowly. It turned, looking directly into the hidden camera lens. For a staggering, impossible second, the animal seemed to see her right through the screen, right through the walls of the barn, right into her soul. It was not a look of aggression, but of ancient intelligence, a profound and weary acknowledgement. The connection was instantaneous and terrifying. In that moment, the line between observer and participant dissolved. This was no longer a pest problem. It was a reckoning, and Anya Sharma knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she couldn't just call the authorities. She couldn't look away. Her fingers trembled as she paused the footage, the bear's impossibly knowing gaze frozen on the screen. Anya pushed back from her desk, the worn wooden chair scraping against the floorboards of the barn's converted office space. This wasn't just a simple nuisance animal. This was a problem of a magnitude she hadn't anticipated, a mirror reflecting a part of herself she had long tried to keep hidden. She had come to this isolated station years ago, a self-imposed exile in the rugged peaks, seeking solace in the quiet rhythms of nature after a loss that had ripped her life apart. The memory of her husband, Dr. Liam Kincaid, still resonated in the empty spaces of her small cabin, a phantom limb ache in her heart. He too had been a biologist, passionate about protecting the wild places they both loved. His sudden, tragic death in a field accident had shattered her, leaving her with a profound fear of connection, of anything that could be loved and then lost. Her work here, rehabilitating injured raptors and small mammals, was her only anchor, her only connection to a world she felt too fragile to rejoin. The barn, a sturdy, century-old structure of rough-hewn timber, was her sanctuary, a place where she could mend broken creatures without having to mend her own broken heart. It was a rigorous, demanding life, but the predictability, the structure, kept the gnawing grief at bay. Now that carefully constructed peace was under siege. The thefts had started subtly, a sack of feed gone here, a broken lock there. Anya had initially blamed local deer or perhaps a particularly clever raccoon. She'd reinforced the flimsy latch, added heavier chains. But the incursions continued, escalating in frequency and brazenness. 2 weeks ago, the large container of specialized avian diet, imported at great expense, had been breached, its contents scattered and half-eaten. Last week, an entire pallet of high-calorie, nutrient-dense kibble, reserved for her larger recovering patients, had simply vanished overnight. The damage wasn't just to her supplies, it was to her entire operation. Her funding was limited, her patients dependent on the precise diets she provided. This was no longer an annoyance. It was a professional crisis that threatened to unravel her sanctuary, forcing her to confront the world she had so desperately avoided. She had even considered giving up, calling in a ranger, but the thought of failing her animals, of allowing this hidden predator to succeed, had spurred her to action, to install the camera, to finally uncover the truth. And now, the truth was worse, more complicated, more deeply unsettling than any fox or raccoon. It was a massive grizzly, an animal that carried the weight of the wilderness in its ancient eyes, an animal that seemed to look right back at her. Anya leaned forward, her elbows on the cold desk, staring at the paused image. The bear's eyes, even in infrared, held a depth she couldn't categorize, a knowing vulnerability that pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. She watched the footage again, rewinding, replaying the moment when his head turned, when his gaze locked onto the lens. It was a quiet, almost spiritual exchange, devoid of menace, brimming instead with an unspoken communication that resonated deep within her. Her breath hitched. The professional detachment she had cultivated for years, the thick wall she had built around her heart, had just been completely shattered. The shattered pieces of her detachment lay scattered across the monitor's screen. Anya didn't just watch Kael's gaze again. She dissected it. Her scientific mind, a relentless engine even in the face of profound emotional disturbance, began to click into gear. This was no longer just a thief, it was a subject, a complex wounded organism requiring investigation. She spent the next day expanding her surveillance network, adding more motion-activated cameras around the barn perimeter, angling them to capture his entry and exit, his movements within the shadows. She wanted to map his entire nightly canvas. The feed streamed constantly to a small monitor in her living quarters, a quiet hum that became the new backdrop to her solitary life. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the grainy, monochrome appearances of the massive bear. She gave him a name, whispered it to the silent screen one dawn, when he paused, his breath pluming in the cold air before melting into the pines. Kael. It felt right, an ancient name for an ancient spirit. Through relentless observation, Anya's expert eye began to piece together Kael's story. Each frame revealed a new detail, a new piece of the puzzle. His movements were slow, deliberate. He favored his left hind leg, a pronounced limp evident in the footage, growing worse on colder nights. Along his flank, a mosaic of deep, jagged scars spoke of past battles, of a life lived hard and violently. He was old, she realized, his muzzle flecked with gray, his coat matted in places where the fur refused to thicken despite the food. He wasn't a young, aggressive male claiming territory. He was a survivor, likely pushed out of prime hunting grounds by younger, stronger bears. His inability to hunt effectively was glaring. He didn't stalk, he scavenged. He didn't fight, he retreated. He wasn't a predator, not in the way her training defined one. He was a patient, a magnificent creature struggling against the inevitable tide of time and injury. The implications settled heavy in her chest, a lead weight where her professional objectivity used to reside. Protocol etched into every fiber of her being demanded she report a nuisance bear to Fish and Wildlife. A bear habituated to human food, especially one raiding structures, was a dangerous bear. The outcome was almost certain: tranquilization, relocation, and if the behavior persisted, euthanasia. A death sentence. Anya's heart seized at the thought, an unwelcome echo of a loss she thought she had buried. To call the authorities would be to sign Kael's death warrant, to condemn him for the crime of survival. But to do nothing, to interfere, was to break every rule, to risk her career, her sanctuary, even her life. She paced her small cabin, the hum of the monitors a dull throb in her ears. Her training screamed caution, logic, professional distance. Her heart, newly cracked open by Kael's weary gaze, whispered a plea for compassion. She remembered the empty ache of her own past, the feeling of being utterly alone, fighting against an indifferent world. Kael, with his ancient eyes and limping gait, mirrored that quiet desperation. The terror of caring, of forming another bond only to face its inevitable loss, clawed at her, sharp and immediate. Yet the alternative, to abandon him to a fate she could prevent, felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever believed in, a violation of the very reason she had come to this remote corner of the world. She couldn't bring herself to make the call. That night, as the stars wheeled overhead and the wind whispered through the eaves of the barn, Anya stood at her window. Her breath fogged the glass. She watched the empty space where Kael always appeared, a silent sentinel in the monochrome world, and made a silent decision. The silent decision Anya made at her window solidified with the first rays of dawn, hardening into something resolute, almost fierce. She moved through her small research station with a new quiet purpose, her scientific mind now bent to a different kind of problem solving. This wasn't about prevention anymore. This was about intervention. Instead of fortifying the barn's defenses, she gathered a new, unopened sack of high-protein, nutrient-dense feed, the kind she reserved for the most vulnerable of her rescued patients. The plastic crinkled loudly in the quiet house, each sound amplified in the stillness of her transgression. She checked the wind, pulled on her thickest insulated jacket, and stepped out into the biting morning air. The crisp, cold bit at her exposed skin, a stark reminder of the wild world she was about to engage with on its own terms. Her heart thrummed a steady, anxious rhythm against her ribs. She didn't reinforce the barn door. She didn't set new traps or deterrents. Instead, she carried the heavy sack not toward the structure, but away from it. Past the last fence line, beyond the faint illumination of her motion sensor lights, into the skeletal embrace of the barren winter woods. The snow crunched under her boots, a sharp, intrusive sound in the profound quiet. She stopped at the very edge of the tree line, a safe distance from her rehabilitation enclosures, and placed the sack gently on a patch of relatively clear snow. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the drawstring open, revealing the rich, granular contents. It was an offering, a conscious, dangerous offering, a clear breach of every protocol she had ever sworn to uphold. She looked at the open bag, then at the impenetrable darkness of the woods, and then back at her warm, safe house. The line was drawn. She turned and walked back, not looking over her shoulder, the weight of her choice settling heavy upon her. The next few hours stretched into an eternity. Anya moved through her daily chores, her movements automatic, her mind fixated on the silent, open sack at the edge of the woods. She ate dinner, but tasted nothing. The scientific detachment she usually wore, like a second skin, had frayed, replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. As twilight deepened and then gave way to the deep, inky blackness of a moonless night, she found herself at the large picture window in her living room, a mug of cold tea forgotten in her hand. The infrared camera feed from the barn played silently on a small monitor nearby, but her eyes were fixed on the real-time view, straining against the gloom. The hum of the heating system, the distant cry of a nocturnal bird. Every sound seemed magnified, every moment stretched. Then a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the trees. It moved with a familiar, heavy grace. Kael, his immense form, a dark silhouette against the paler snow, emerged cautiously. He stopped, perhaps 50 feet from the offering, his great head lifting. He tested the air, a long, slow intake of scent, then another. Anya held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet house. Would he know? Would he understand? Would he trust? Kael took another slow, deliberate step, then another. His movements were wary, every muscle tensed but driven by an undeniable hunger. He approached the open sack, his massive snout lowering to inspect the contents. He nudged it, sniffed deeply, then tentatively began to eat. The scene was utterly quiet, reverent in its simplicity. It felt less like feeding a wild animal and more like a sacred ritual, an ancient exchange witnessed across an impossible divide. He ate slowly, steadily, his movements almost meditative. There was no aggression, no frantic tearing, just the steady consumption of life-giving sustenance. When he had eaten his fill, Kyle didn't immediately turn and disappear back into the night. Instead, he stood, his great bulk silhouetted against the faint glimmer of the snow, and slowly turned his head. He looked directly toward the house, toward Anya's window. It was a mirror of that impossible moment on the camera feed, but this time it was real, unmediated by a lens or a screen. His eyes, though unseen in the darkness, felt like they pierced straight through the glass, through the walls, straight into her. It was not a look of challenge or fear, but of profound, ancient intelligence, a knowing. In that moment, Anya felt seen, truly seen for the first time in years. The connection was instantaneous, undeniable. The wall around her heart, carefully constructed over years of grief, crumbled. After a long, silent moment that stretched into eternity, Kyle turned, a magnificent dark presence, and melted back into the shadows of the woods. Anya stood utterly still, staring at the empty space, the silence of the night pressing in around her. She felt an echo of his warmth, a phantom presence that lingered. "You're welcome," she whispered to the empty darkness, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. That whispered "you're welcome" hung in the cold night air, an admission of vulnerability Anya hadn't voiced in years. The next morning, the lingering chill was not just from the mountain air, but from the unsettling warmth that had settled in her chest. The quiet arrangement began, a shared secret between a reclusive biologist and a wild creature. Weeks folded into a month, then another. Each evening, as dusk bled across the sky, Anya would carefully place a sack of high-protein feed at the edge of the tree line, far enough from the barn to maintain separation, close enough to be an unmistakable offering. She'd retreat to her window, a mug of herbal tea warming her hands, the infrared monitor casting its ghostly green glow on her face. Every night Kyle came. The routine was a rhythm, a silent dance. Anya would watch, utterly still, as the massive grizzly emerged from the shadows, a spectre against the monochrome display. He moved with a cautious grace, his great head swiveling, sniffing the air, always checking. Then the careful approach to the food, the deliberate tearing of the sack, the methodical consumption. It was a primal act witnessed through the cold lens of technology, yet it felt profoundly intimate. Inside her research station, Anya would tend to her smaller patients, a mending raptor, a fox recovering from a snare. Their delicate lives a stark contrast to Kyle's raw power. But Kyle was her most profound patient, though she dared not acknowledge it. Through the camera, she saw the subtle changes, tracking his progress with the meticulous eye of a scientist. His pronounced limp, once a heavy, dragging shuffle, became less evident, transforming into a more fluid, albeit still careful stride. The matted patches in his fur began to fill in, replaced by a richer, thicker coat, gleaming even in the grainy night vision. He was gaining weight, his silhouette filling out, the gauntness receding from his powerful frame. He was not just surviving, he was healing. As Kyle's physical wounds mended, a parallel healing unfolded within Anya. The rigid lines of professional detachment around her own heart began to soften. She found herself speaking aloud, not to a colleague, but to the empty night, to the silent, watching presence she knew was out there. She'd whisper details of her day, frustrations with a difficult grant application, a moment of triumph when a young owl took its first flight. Kyle, though unseen from her window, became the unwitting audience for her unspoken grief, the quiet echo of a past loss that had driven her to this solitary mountain sanctuary. It was as if, by tending to his visible wounds, she was slowly, unconsciously stitching together her own invisible ones. Her voice, once hushed and purely scientific, grew softer, more tender. The distance between observer and participant, once a chasm, narrowed to a thread. She was no longer just a biologist documenting a species. She was a caretaker, a confidant, finding solace in this impossible one-sided communion. The deepest connections she was learning were not chosen, they were recognized. Then the first snows came, a delicate dusting at first, barely clinging to the pine needles, but a herald of what was to follow. The air grew sharp, biting. The mountains, once a verdant tapestry, began to bleach to a stark white beauty. The stakes, already impossibly high, ratcheted up with each falling flake. Winter here was relentless, unforgiving. For an old, recovering bear, a season of struggle was about to intensify into a fight for survival. Anya's concern, once a professional curiosity mixed with compassion, escalated into a fierce, protective anxiety that buzzed beneath her skin. The generosity of her nightly offering now felt less like a kindness and more like a desperate gamble. Each morning she'd scan the horizon, watching the snow pile up, her face etched with worry, realizing her quiet arrangement could not last forever. The premonition, a cold whisper on the wind, became a roar. A brutal blizzard descended upon the mountains, a furious, white-out assault that lasted 3 days. Snow piled against the research station's windows, burying the barn and obscuring the world in a swirling, featureless grey. Anya watched from her frost-rimmed kitchen, the generator's hum a lonely counterpoint to the storm's fury. She pictured Kyle, hunkered down in some sheltered den, riding out the tempest. She had to believe he was safe. Her own world shrank to the 4 walls of her cabin, the only connection to the outside, a distant, flickering memory of his powerful, watchful eyes. She busied herself with her small, rescued patients, an owl with a broken wing, a young fox recovering from a snare. But a part of her remained outside, straining against the gale. When the storm finally broke, the world lay under a blanket of impossible white, pristine and silent. The air was sharp, biting. Anya, bundled against the intense cold, went to the edge of the woods, to the usual offering spot. The snow lay undisturbed. She scattered the feed anyway, a desperate hope against the vast, empty landscape. She returned to the cabin, scanning the ridge, the dark line of trees, the glint of ice. Nothing. Night fell, a deep, starry blackness that offered no comfort. Kyle did not appear. Her breath hitched in her chest. One night, she told herself, he's just recovering. He's slow. But the second night brought the same crushing absence. The food remained untouched. The grainy camera footage, usually a silent testament to his nightly visits, showed only a swirling vortex of snow, then a static, empty frame. Her anxiety became a physical weight pressing down on her lungs. Sleep was impossible. She paced, her mind a frantic loop of worst-case scenarios. His old leg, the infection she'd only glimpsed, the sheer cold. He was old, he was injured, he was alone. The professional detachment she usually employed, a shield forged through years of scientific rigor, had long since corroded. This was not a biological subject, this was Kyle. And Kyle was in trouble. At dawn on the 3rd day of his absence, a stark decision crystallized. Fear had no place now, only purpose. Protocol be damned. She moved with a focused intensity, gathering her gear. Snowshoes clacked against the frozen mudroom floor. She packed a heavy-duty medical kit, antibiotics, pain relief, bandages. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, she retrieved the tranquilizer rifle from its locked cabinet, not for aggression, but for absolute necessity, for safety, hers, and perhaps even his, should he be injured and defensive. Slinging it over her shoulder, the cold steel a heavy promise against her back, she stepped out into the blinding white. The world was vast, unforgiving. Her breath plumed in icy clouds. She scanned for tracks, finding the faint, snow-dusted depressions of Kael's last known movements before the storm, heading towards the higher ground, towards the treacherous ravines. Every step was a battle. The snow was hip-deep in places, a physical wall that resisted her progress. Her muscles screamed. The wind, though calmer than the blizzard, still whipped icy tendrils around her, biting at exposed skin. She pushed through drifts, over fallen logs, her eyes relentlessly sweeping the frozen landscape. Ahead, always ahead. Footprints, faint, fading. She ignored the burning in her lungs, the cold numbing her fingers, the ominous silence of the mountains. He had to be out here. He had to be. Hours blurred into an agonizing blur of physical exertion and mounting dread. The sun, a pale disk in the sky, began its descent. She was high above the tree line now, nearing the jagged maw of an ice-choked ravine. Her heart hammered, not from exertion alone, but from a cold, sickening premonition. Then, amidst a cluster of snow-laden pines near a steep drop-off, she saw it. A massive, dark shape, half buried in a drift, not moving, not breathing. A silent scream tore through her throat, but no sound escaped. She plunged forward, scrambling, sliding down the incline, her snowshoes biting into the crust. He lay there, immense and still, an unnatural stillness that stole her breath. His fur was matted, encrusted with ice. His head was slumped, one massive paw splayed at an awkward angle. She could see it now, the source of her dread. The old leg injury, swollen to a grotesque size, an angry purplish mass festering beneath his matted fur. He was alive, barely. A shallow, ragged breath, then another. He was too weak to be a threat, his strength utterly spent. Not a wild beast now, just a patient in desperate need. Anya sank to her knees in the snow beside the massive, dying animal, her hand hovering just above his fur. The full weight of his life now in her hands. Anya sank to her knees in the snow beside the massive, dying animal, her hand hovering just above his fur. The full weight of his life now in her hands. She knew instantly, with a cold, clear certainty, that she couldn't move him. This was it. This perilous, snow-choked ravine, miles from any semblance of safety or civilization, would be his operating room, his sickbed, his final resting place, or his chance at life. The very air around them hummed with a primal tension, the wildness of the landscape demanding deference, threatening retribution for such a profound transgression. "Kael," she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy sound against the vast silence. She spoke to him not as a scientist to a specimen, but as one desperate soul to another, her words a low, soothing monologue that poured out her own story as much as it explained his imminent ordeal. "I can't leave you. I won't. You understand, don't you? This old leg, it's killing you. I know about old wounds, Kael. I know how they fester, how they can break you, how they make you hide from the world." Her breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a tiny, visible offering in the quiet, reverent space they now occupied. She knelt closer, her eyes scanning the massive form, his ragged breaths still shallow. The decision was made. There was no turning back, no professional code left unviolated, no line uncrossed. Her professional identity, carefully constructed over years to shield her from emotional vulnerability, was dissolving in the face of this immediate, undeniable need. She moved with painstaking care, her gloved fingers trembling slightly as she unzipped her medical kit, the metallic click echoing too loudly. The antiseptic solution was searingly cold as it touched his skin, a sharp clinical smell cutting through the earthy scent of wet fur and pine. He rumbled, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the frozen ground, a groan of discomfort that tightened Anya's chest. His immense head, heavy and matted with snow, shifted slightly, but his eyes remained half-closed, glazed with fever and pain. She cleaned the grotesque wound, gently clearing away the matted fur and congealed blood, revealing the raw, angry flesh beneath. Each careful swab was an act of profound intimacy, a moment of perilous trust. This was not a bear in a cage, sedated and compliant. This was a wild god of the mountains, laid low, vulnerable, and yet capable of lethal force with a single instinctual swipe. Her hand, so small against his flank, moved with a surgeon's precision, an artist's tenderness. Then came the needle, thick and long, glinting dully in the dim light. She found the muscle, a thick mass of sinew and power, and pushed. Cale flinched, a spasm rippling through his enormous body, his teeth baring in a silent grimace of pain. But he did not move to strike. He held still, a profound, almost spiritual surrender in his quiet acceptance. The antibiotic pulsed into his bloodstream, a tiny, invisible army sent to fight the unseen enemy within. Anya felt the tremor of his skin under her touch, the warmth of his immense body radiating against her. This was the rawest connection she had ever known, a silent pact forged in the heart of winter, in defiance of all reason. She couldn't leave him, not like this, not after this. The thought was a fierce protective instinct overwhelming any concern for her own safety. Scrabbling at the fallen branches, she began to construct a crude shelter nearby, a lean-to against a cluster of pines, barely enough to break the wind. She gathered dry wood, her fingers numb, and with shaking hands coaxed a small fire to life. The first fragile flame was a beacon in the encroaching twilight, throwing dancing shadows across the snowy landscape, illuminating Kael's still form. She sat by the fire, the tranquilizer rifle across her lap, her eyes fixed on the massive bear. The air bit at her exposed skin, but a deeper cold settled in her bones, a primal fear battling with an even more primal connection. Through the long, cold hours of the night, she watched him, the fire crackling a soft lullaby against the vast silence. She saw the steam of her own breath, a visible testament to her continued vigil. She smelled the pine resin from the fire, the damp earth, the musky scent of the bear. She felt the heavy thrum of the earth beneath her, a shared heartbeat with the wounded creature. It was a night outside of time, a crucible where her old self burned away, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of her commitment. She dozed fitfully, waking to every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind, her gaze always returning to Kael. As the first blush of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and violet, a profound stillness settled over the ravine. Kael stirred, a deep, resonant rumble starting in his chest and vibrating through the ground. He shifted, a slow, deliberate movement, and then, with immense effort, lifted his great head. His eyes, no longer clouded with fever, met Anya's. They were clear, lucid, holding an ancient intelligence. The fever had broken. Kael's eyes, clear and lucid, held an ancient intelligence as they met Anya's. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, a fragile thread woven in the stillness of the dawn. Anya, her hand still hovering, felt the tremor of his life force, strong now, pushing against the encroaching cold. The fever had broken. The world felt held in a single sacred breath when a sharp crack of snow underfoot shattered the spell. Anya's head snapped up, her heart seized. Coming through the pines, a figure moved with the deliberate, practice rhythm of someone accustomed to deep snow, snowshoes biting into the fresh powder. It was Ben, a park ranger, his face partially obscured by a thick beard frosted with rime, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He carried a heavy pack, a rifle slung across his back. His eyes, usually warm and quick, widened in disbelief as they first registered the massive, calm grizzly in the snow. Then Anya kneeling beside him, antibiotic syringe still clutched in her gloved hand. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken accusations. Ben stopped a dozen yards away, his snowshoes hissing. The only sound for a long moment was Kyle's deep, rhythmic breathing and the frantic pounding of Anya's own heart. Anya? Ben's voice was low, strained, the name barely a whisper against the vast silence of the mountains. He was a former colleague, a man who respected protocol above all else, a good man who now looked like he'd stumbled upon a ghost. His gaze flicked from Anya to Kyle, a wild animal far too close, far too calm, and back to Anya, confusion warring with a dawning, terrible understanding. What in God's name are you doing? Anya pushed herself to her feet, slowly, carefully, keeping her body between Ben and Kyle. Her throat felt tight, dry. She couldn't lie. Not now. Not after this. He was injured, Ben, badly, collapsed in the snow. I found him. Her voice was hoarse, raw from the cold and the long vigil. The words sounded weak, insufficient against the monumental transgression before them. Ben slowly unsnapped the rifle from his shoulder, not raising it, but the simple act was a clear, chilling statement. You know the policy, Anya, he said, his voice hardening, each word a hammer blow. A nuisance bear, a bear that loses its fear of humans. You know what that means. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Kyle, who merely watched them, unmoving. You've signed his death warrant. The accusation stung, sharp and immediate. Anya's composure, so recently returned, threatened to crack. No, she stated, her voice stronger now, a defiant edge beginning to emerge. He's not a nuisance. He's a survivor. Look at him, Ben. He has old injuries. He was starving. He raided my barn out of desperation, not aggression. She gestured vaguely towards the ravine, her hand trembling slightly. He wasn't able to hunt. He wasn't able to make it through the winter. She felt a burning need to make Ben see Kyle, not just classify him. I couldn't just leave him to die. Ben shook his head, a grim line set to his mouth. You're a biologist, Anya. You know the risks. You know the precedent. Once a bear associates humans with food, with safety, there's no going back. It's dangerous for him, and it's dangerous for you, and for anyone else who might come across him. You've compromised yourself, and you've compromised him. His eyes, usually filled with a knowing warmth, were now professional, cold. He's not a pet, Anya. You know that better than anyone. He's not a statistic, Ben, Anya retorted, her voice rising, passionate now, shaking off the fear and finding a desperate, aching truth. He's not just another data point. He looked at me, Ben, through the camera, through the darkness. He knew I was there. And when I brought him food, he knew that too. He needed help. I felt it. I felt what he was going through. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered, reflecting her own deep-seated grief and isolation, her own profound need for a second chance. He's not a textbook case. He's Kyle. She pleaded with her eyes, with every line of her desperate, determined face. Look at him, Ben. Just look. Ben, silent, looked from Anya's impassioned face to the calm, watchful bear, his professional certainty beginning to waver. The silent tableau hung heavy in the crisp mountain air. Ben, a man etched with the practicality of regulations and the quiet dedication of a ranger, shifted his gaze from Anya's earnest, tear-streaked face to the massive grizzly, still and breathing shallowly in the snow. He saw the ancient scars, the matted fur around the inflamed wound, the almost reverent way Anya had knelt beside him. He saw Kael not as a nuisance, but as a testament to the raw, enduring will to live. And in Anya, he saw not a rogue biologist, but a woman finally allowing her heart to break open. A long, slow exhale escaped him, misting in the cold. "You're right," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper against the vast silence of the wilderness. "He's not a statistic, and you've done something extraordinary here, Anya. Something against every protocol, every rule. But I understand why." His eyes met hers, a deep, weary understanding passing between them. "I can't pretend this didn't happen, not entirely, but I can help make sure it doesn't end how it should, by the book." A wave of relief, so profound it nearly buckled Anya's knees, washed over her. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with emotion. Ben moved with purpose, his years of experience kicking in. "He needs a proper den, insulated, secure, away from here. We can't have him habituated to this proximity to your barn or your research station." His gaze swept the surrounding terrain. "There's a natural rock overhang about a mile north, nestled in a stand of fir. Good drainage, relatively hidden. We can reinforce it." He pulled out his satellite phone, already thinking logistics. "I'll need to call in a small team, people I trust. Officially, we're tracking a potential problem bear for relocation. Unofficially, we're buying him time. You'll lead on the medical side. I'll handle the logistics and the cover story." It was a delicate dance, a professional tightrope walk. But Ben's conviction was clear. Over the next 2 days, under a sky that threatened more snow but held off, a small, discreet team worked with a quiet efficiency. They utilized a specialized transport sled, usually reserved for tranquilized problem animals, and carefully, meticulously moved Kael. Anya watched over him, administering a stronger sedative just enough to keep him calm during the transfer, whispering words of reassurance against his ear. The new den was exactly as Ben described, a formidable natural hollow, which they quickly supplemented with a thick bed of dry pine needles and insulating tarps. It was a haven, a sanctuary hidden deep within the winter-bruised mountains. Ben brought in specialized, nutrient-dense supplements, the kind usually reserved for zoo animals or critical rehabilitation cases, ensuring Kyle received the best possible chance at recovery without further taxing his injured body. But with every act of compassion came a stark, professional reality. Ben stood with Anya outside the den entrance, the scent of pine and damp earth heavy in the cold air. "This isn't forever, Anya," he stated, his voice firm but not unkind. "You know that. We're giving him a second chance, a fighting chance to make it through winter and fully recover. But when the spring thaw comes, when he's strong enough, he has to go. He has to re-wild completely. No more food offerings, no more close proximity. He needs to fear humans again, not see them as a source of sustenance or comfort." Anya nodded, her gaze fixed on the quiet darkness of the den. "I know," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. That was always the goal, to get him strong enough to be free. But the ache in her chest was already starting, the bittersweet truth settling deep in her bones. Success, in this case, meant goodbye. The spring thaw wasn't just a seasonal change, it was a ticking clock, a deadline for Kyle's ultimate freedom and for her own inevitable heartache. Their shared purpose now shifted, from simply saving his life to preparing him for a return to a wildness that, by definition, excluded her. It was a race against time, a final, profound act of love. Anya and Ben watched Kyle resting in the new den, a shared look of understanding and impending loss passing between them. The unspoken deadline hung in the crisp mountain air, a silent promise hovering between Anya and Ben as they watched Kael from the mouth of his new den. Then, as if a great cosmic breath had been drawn, the world began to exhale. First, the tentative drip of meltwater from eaves, a lone, hopeful sound in the vast silence. Then, a rush, a cascade. Spring arrived not with a gentle unfurling, but with an insistent, undeniable surge. Ice surrendered its grip on the river, sending roaring currents downstream. Patches of brown earth emerged from beneath the snow, then hesitant shoots of green, pushing their way into the lengthening daylight. The mountains shed their white shroud, revealing the rugged contours of an ancient landscape reborn. Kael, too, was reborn. Day by day, his strength returned in powerful, undeniable waves. His limp, once so pronounced, was now barely perceptible, a faint memory in his powerful gait. His fur, thick and glossy, shimmered with renewed health, a testament to Anya's relentless care. He moved with the effortless grace of a creature perfectly attuned to its environment, his eyes bright, alert, and increasingly wild. His dependence on Anya, once a fragile tether, began to fray, replaced by an instinct to roam, to explore, to reclaim the vast wilderness that was his birthright. She saw it in the way he lingered less at the den's entrance, in the growing distance he put between himself and the scent of human hands. She saw it, and her heart ached with a bittersweet pride. The slow goodbye began, a deliberate, agonizing process. Each morning, Anya would prepare his food, but the portions grew smaller, less substantial. She started leaving it further from the den, forcing him to range wider, to forage more. Soon, the offering stopped entirely. It was a conscious act of severance, a teaching of forgotten ways. She was showing him that he must fend for himself again, that the easy sustenance of her barn was a chapter closed. Each day he wandered further. Each day he stayed away longer. Every departure felt like a practice run for the ultimate severance, a painful rehearsal for a final solitary farewell. Anya would stand at her window, binoculars pressed to her eyes, watching his magnificent form shrink into the distance, a primal fear clutching at her throat. He was safe, she reminded herself. He was strong. But the emotional toll was immense, a daily chipping away at the fragile peace she had found. She missed his presence, the quiet reassurance that he was near, even if unseen. Her world, which had expanded to include him, now felt like it was contracting, leaving an empty space that throbbed with unacknowledged grief. Yet, through this painful unfolding, Anya herself was changing, blossoming like the mountain flora around her. The woman who had retreated to this remote corner of the world, broken and walled off, was slowly, irrevocably healing. Kael's journey had been her own. His desperation had mirrored her quiet grief. His recovery had mirrored her reawakening. She realized now, with a clarity that both humbled and strengthened her, that he hadn't just needed her help to survive, he had saved her too. He had cracked open the protective shell around her heart, forcing her to feel again, to care with a fierce, unwavering intensity. She found a profound peace in the understanding that true love was not about possession or even proximity, but about freedom. His freedom, and by extension, her own. She was no longer the broken woman who hid from the world, but a whole, resilient being, capable of enduring the pain of letting go because she had first known the joy of connection. Her gratitude for him, for this impossible bond, was a deep, quiet current beneath the surface of her sadness. One crisp afternoon, the air alive with the scent of pine and damp earth, Anya found herself on a distant ridge, higher than she usually ventured. She scanned the landscape with her binoculars, a familiar knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. Then, through the powerful lenses, she saw him. Not foraging, not just moving, but actively hunting. a large, agile buck grazing innocently in a meadow far below. Kael was a ghost in the dappled light of the pines, his movements fluid and precise, a predator reclaiming his rightful place in the hierarchy of the wild. The stalk was masterful, silent, culminating in a swift, decisive rush. Anya watched Kael successfully take down prey on a distant ridge through binoculars, a moment of quiet triumph and heartbreak. The sight of Kael bringing down the buck, a display of raw, untamed power, had been the ultimate confirmation. He was whole again. He was a survivor, thriving exactly where he belonged. Anya had lowered the binoculars, a knot of conflicting emotions in her chest, pride, awe, and an ache that was both profound and beautiful. She had watched the wildness reclaim him, and in doing so, it had also set her free. That night, she slept more deeply than she had in years. The following morning, a crisp, clean mountain dawn, Anya woke with a sense of quiet finality. There was no dread, no desperate clinging, only a clear, undeniable knowing. Today was the day. She moved with purpose, leaving her own barn secured, her charges fed. She didn't take the binoculars this time. Her eyes needed no mediation for what was coming. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. Sunlight, still low in the sky, painted the peaks in hues of gold and rose. She walked the familiar path to the high ridge overlooking the expansive valley, the one Kael had claimed as his hunting grounds. Her breath plumed in the cold air, a steady rhythm matching her heartbeat. He was there, not moving, not foraging, but standing silhouetted against the rising sun, at the very edge of the high country, the boundary of his true world. His coat, rich and dark, shimmered with newfound health, a testament to resilience. He looked magnificent. A king surveyed his dominion. He was no longer Kael, the hungry, injured ghost raiding her barn, nor the patient she had nursed. He was simply the bear, the spirit of these mountains. Anya stopped at her chosen vantage point, a respectful distance away, the vast expanse of the valley between them. She simply stood, a silent witness. Slowly, deliberately, Kael turned his great head. His eyes, dark and ancient, found her across the vast distance. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a clear, final acknowledgement. A profound, weary look of understanding passed between them, a shared moment of goodbye, understood without a single sound. There was no need for words, no gestures, only this silent communion that spanned the wilderness. He held her gaze for what felt like an eternity, a final, wordless affirmation of their impossible bond. Then, with an almost imperceptible shift of his powerful shoulders, he turned away from her, toward the endless expanse of timber, toward the high peaks. He melted into the dark line of trees, a shadow swallowed by the wilderness, gone. Months later, the mountains still held their secrets, but Anya no longer felt held captive by her own. Her small rehabilitation center hummed with a different energy, a lighter one. The barn remained secure, the protocols in place, but her heart was open, a window to the world she had once walled off. Ben, the park ranger, who had become an unexpected ally and then a trusted friend, visited regularly now, often bringing supplies or just companionship. They sat on her porch one afternoon, the late summer sun warm on their faces, the air filled with the buzz of bees and the distant cry of a hawk. Anya was laughing, a full, uninhibited sound that rarely escaped her before Kael. She spoke of expanding her work, of new research proposals, of collaborations. The isolation that had once defined her was a distant memory. She was connected again, not just to the animals she healed, but to the wider world, to human friendship, to her own future. She looked up at the vast mountain range, the peaks sharp against the endless blue sky. not with a sense of loss, but with a quiet, reverent gratitude. A gentle smile touched her lips. The connection remains, transcendent and